Welcome to Taking Stock. We're very good, we human beings, at making other people feel excluded. We may not do it obviously. We may not even do it deliberately. We do it nonetheless. We do it through language, of course, and also through customs and through habit. We club together in our little interest groups and we exclude anyone else. It's almost as if we can only spare the emotional energy to relate to a relatively small group of people before we begin to ignore and then to exclude those with whom we cannot cope. I once spent a month in Germany shadowing a German minister, Methodist minister, a friend of mine from college days. It was one of the most frustrating experiences of my life. My German wasn't bad, but not quite good enough to be able to cope with the dialect that all those around me used, which was Schwäbisch. I could deal with one person speaking slowly, but not more than one speaking at a time. Around a dinner table with 5 or 6 people, all conversing normally, but faster than I could cope with in Schwäbisch, and more than one at a time, and I was completely lost. It was as if I were continually grabbing the coattails of the conversation. I had just begun to grasp what was being talked about when the conversation moved on. Surrounded by some of the nicest people I have ever met, with whom I had much in common, from sport to motorbikes to music to religion, I felt, annoyingly, more than a little shut off and inadvertently excluded. I found myself having conversations in my head with myself or with people who weren't there. It was almost schizophrenic. It was also one of the strangest experiences I've ever had, to understand one word in 5 or 6 and be struggling to catch up by filling the gaps with guesses. At one function, someone had been asking me about my daughter because the lady had heard that she played the cello. My daughter. The lady asked me a question and confused me totally. Had she got the idea that my daughter had died? I didn't know how she'd got that idea. I didn't know what to say. I turned to my German minister friend. Frank, this lady's just asked me if Anna's died. Who told her my daughter was dead? Frank asked my questioner to ask again, listened to her question, and then he burst out laughing. She asks you if your daughter enjoys the cello, he said through his chortling. What? I was sure she asked me if she died. Later, said Frank. I'll explain later. Later, he explained that I'd heard almost correctly, but misinterpreted what she said. Believe it or not, the word that means to die in a conflict is the same in German as the verb to enjoy, gefallen. Only the context tells you which is meant, especially in conversation. Now, some might say it explains a lot about the history of the 20th century when 60 million people use the same word for die in a conflict and enjoy. All I can say is they call this a language. After that experience, my sense of exclusion was almost total, even though I knew that everyone was doing their level best to include me in everything. Imagine what it must be like for someone who feels that they are being deliberately excluded from something. Of course, all special interest groups by definition are exclusive. Football fans, musicians, computer experts, opera buffs, doctors, calligraphers, dustmen, printers, physicists, mechanics, lawyers, mathematicians, you name it. All of you are in at least one, and probably more, special interest group. You all have your own language, vocabulary and syntax, and even using those terms might exclude you, which either deliberately or as a byproduct of what you do excludes everyone else outside the group. Even families have exclusive language. My father served 22 years in the Royal Navy. I was 15 before I found out that the thing we walked on indoors was a floor, not a deck. Or that we went to the toilet, not the heads. Once, when I was invited for dinner with a friend, I was offered a second helping of Yorkshire pudding. My friend's mum assumed I'd refused, as I had said that I would go round the boy with the Yorkshire pud. Actually, I was saying yes. Even at my father's funeral, we spoke our own family language. My father never ever said that someone had died. He always said that they had handed in their scraper. It came from the Navy again. On board one of my dad's ships, whenever they'd been at sea a long time, the captain would find somewhere relatively sheltered and safe, anchor the ship, and have some ratings lowered over the side in cradles to scrape the sides of the ship clear of weeds and barnacles, with paint scrapers or something similar. At the end of the watch, every rating had to solemnly hand in his scraper to the petty officer or leading seaman before going off watch. So forever after, when someone had gone off watch in the eternal sense, my dad would say that he or she had handed in his scraper. My brother and I both had the same bright idea without telling each other. I had a wreath made in the shape of an anchor, and on top of it I placed a brand new B&Q paint scraper. The funeral director and the minister who did the funeral had no idea why, and I didn't tell them. But my brother went one better. He paid a visit to the funeral directors the night before the funeral and placed a brand new paint scraper actually in my father's hand before they sealed the coffin. What my brother didn't know, and I did, was that when a coffin is cremated, the ashes drop down through a grate onto a proving tray, and they're then scraped out into a big metal box, and a huge electric-powered industrial magnet is run through the ashes to pick up the nails from the coffin, artificial joints, and anything else ferrous. I would have loved to have seen the look on the face of the crematorium staff when they saw the blade of a paint scraper leap out of my father's ashes to cling to the magnet. I should imagine that to this day, some crematorium worker somewhere is wondering just exactly which part of my father's anatomy that had been grafted onto. Even the church has exclusive language and exclusive behaviour at times too. With no disrespect to the Church of England, most of their services confuse me. I'm a simple Methodist. But I've never been as confused by anything as much as I have been confused by one particular Anglican service I went to in Bristol when I was a student minister, at a time when I could count the times I'd ever been in a Church of England church on the fingers of one hand. The congregation was standing up, sitting down, kneeling, speaking, and then suddenly bursting into tuneless song for no apparent reason. And I was getting up just in time to be sitting down again, starting to kneel and realising I should be sitting, and so leaving myself in that kind of awkward crouch, which was neither one thing nor the other. What finished me, though, was one of my fellow students who leant across and whispered, "You put your left leg in, your left leg out." And the thing is, I'm a clergy person, what my brother calls a professional Christian. I ought to know these things. But if I'm caught out by strange rituals, how must the ordinary Joe feel, who maybe has just wandered in off the street into any of our churches, when he sees and hears what we have taken for granted for years? I mean, every church has its rituals which it takes for granted, as I discovered in a German Methodist church and realised too late. That is to say that I was the only one who stood up to sing the hymn, or come to that, who stayed seated for the prayers. Confused is not the first word that springs to mind to describe it. Completely banjaxed. Now, that might spring to mind. It's a shame, really, that sometimes we in the churches, by default, succumb to the pressure to exclude, because it certainly isn't intended. Not all Christians are Freemasons, after all. Jesus did not exclude anyone from his fellowship. No one who really sought harmony with God anyway. But somehow we've managed it too often in the church. But not by who we are or by how we put our belief into practice. The church is full of well-intentioned, loving, generous people, ordinary people who can laugh at themselves, who can show genuine love in the sense of caring and fellowship to the strangest of people, and who can admit their faults and seek reconciliation. Somehow, though, we still manage to obscure the face of Jesus, the welcoming, rough, and as I imagine it, sunburnt working man's face of Jesus. And we obscure it behind a screen of baffling language, much of which, the language I mean, was obscure when it was first penned, but now is almost incomprehensible. I spend a portion of my time looking for hymns, as you might imagine, when I'm preparing the services. And there are hymns we used to sing at school, and there's one that's still in the 1985 Methodist hymn book, Hymns and Psalms. I haven't looked at Singing the Faith for it, but look at these words. O measureless might, ineffable love, while angels delight to hymn thee above, thy humbler creation, though feeble their lays, with true adoration shall sing to thy praise. And it used to be worse. It used to be lisp to thy praise when I was at school, which brought forth a whole host of raspberries from the 5th years at the back of the assembly hall. But what does ineffable mean? Incapable of being effed, maybe, but how do you get effed in the first place? As far as I know, I've never effed in my life. In fact, are there any offers on what any of that load of total gobbledygook means? No, Herr Barth, not you. If you're looking at Christianity as an option, please, please, please don't listen to the archaic language. Don't get tied up in knots over the rituals. Don't sweat on the proper place to kneel or stand or sit or sing. Just look at the words of Jesus in the Gospels. Those of you who are already church-going Christians, I plead with you as well. Read the words of Jesus in the Gospels. My yoke is easy and my burden is light, he says in the 11th chapter of Matthew's Gospel. So why do we place upon the shoulders of new believers the burdens of the heavy yoke of our old traditions and our incomprehensible language? Are we a computer users group or a Amdram society, or are we a church? When Jesus taught, he used examples from people's normal daily life and work. He didn't dream up fantastic theological problems, nor burden them with examples they couldn't possibly understand. What did he talk about? The Holy Ghost as numinous? God as kerugma? The efficacy of the temple sacrifices? The 15 different theories of the atonement and why every other one except ours is wrong? No, not really. He may have talked about the meaning of some or even all of those things at some point, but how he talked about them was by talking about how God loved the people Jesus was talking to, how he cared for them, how he wanted them to grow to become whole people, not emotional and spiritual cripples. So he talked to the people on the edge, those who'd been excluded or had excluded themselves, just as much as he talked to those in the thick of things, perhaps even more so. And he talked about things they knew about: sheep, goats, planting, harvest, persecution, money. Talked an awful lot about money, our Jesus. Whatever he talked about, though, when he wanted to make himself plain, he did so in ordinary language, and he excluded no one. Christianity is not a matter of where you are born or who you are born to. It's not a matter of how large your vocabulary is or whether you know all the code words. It's just a matter of saying, here I am, Jesus. Teach me to be me. Stay safe, people.